Hello and welcome to the channel. We've recently seen a lot of early 3D DOS games on the channel, like the ones you see on the screen at the moment. And I thought it would be great to make a video on this topic, so I teamed up with Trixter from the demo scene, who also runs the YouTube channel, the OldSkool PC. And we found nearly 100 early 3D DOS games just from the first 10 years of the PC. So in this video, I want to share with you some of my favorites out of that collection. And we're going to begin with the Sierra 3D Helicopter Simulator. This game goes back to 1987, and I'm running it here on a 286 at 12 MHz with EGA graphics, hence the 16 colors. And as you can see, it's getting a few frames a second. Now, it was a little bit slow to run on an original IBM PC. In the demo mode, it got less than 1 frame a second, and it's really not playable. But I should mention that everything I'm showing in today's video is filmed on genuine hardware, either an IBM PC or a 286 at 6 or 12 MHz. And I'm using genuine CRT monitors. It's exceptionally hard to film these, but I think the result just looks really nice. Now, this game was programmed by Joe Wofford, and Ken Williams himself was actually involved in development. As you can see, there are lots of different locations that you can visit in this game, and as with a lot of Sierra games, it is beautifully coloured. Now, the performance here isn't stunning. I'll show some examples later in the video of some really incredible performance in 3D games that I found on the 286. But this is certainly playable and very, very enjoyable indeed. Now, there's lots of other locations in the game that you can explore yourself, so I'll let you check that out. But this game also offers a combat mode and target practice modes. And in addition to that, it allowed players to play head-to-head via a modem, although some people described it as a little predictable. This is Chuck Yeager's Advanced Flight Trainer, also from 1987, but this game is running on the original IBM PC at 4.77 MHz with an 8088 CPU instead of a 286. And as you can see, we're getting almost the same frame rate that we had in the Sierra Helicopter Simulator, which was running on the much faster machine. Of course, this is just full-color CGA graphics, and after all, it's quite blocky. There are just cubes and tetrahedra and so on. But I think if you owned a PC or XT back in the day, this was really quite good enough to play. And it showed in the sales. This was a hugely popular game. In its first year, it sold 100,000 copies just before it was taken off the shelves due to Microsoft, who believed they owned the term Flight Simulator, complained about the name. It actually had to be changed to Flight Trainer. By 1988, it had sold 250,000 copies. And let me show you what this looks like on a 286. It is dead smooth, showing just how well this game is optimized. The aircraft are really maneuverable, as you can see, and Chuck Yeager actually consulted on this game. His image and voice are actually used. So this is really an outstanding example of what you can do with assembly optimization way back in 1987. The next game is Echelon, also from 1987, but released for DOS in 1988. And as you can see, it runs really slowly on the original IBM PC. So I'm going to show it on the 286 at 12 MHz with EGA graphics. But it has this amazing introduction on the PC speaker. Check this out.
Ready. Rear view. Front view. Missiles activated. Pitch control activated.
This game was produced by Access Software, who, amongst other things, were famous for their later golf games. They produced Microsoft Golf and also Lynx. and of course there were many versions of those. Now, the graphics in this are wireframe 3D instead of filled polygon, and they're dead smooth on the 286, even if it was completely unplayable on the original IBM PC. But these guys are masters of audio. You can hear that there are voice samples on the PC speaker, and there was of course that amazing intro music which we heard. Now, in a moment I'm going to show a little bit of corruption that I experienced on the EGA version of this game. This was actually the best version that I found, and I've left this in just to show what it's like with original games on original hardware. But don't let me put you off trying it out. This is a great game. And for those who don't have the hardware, I am planning to produce a version of this video without my voiceover in the future. Next is Deep Space Operation Copernicus by Surtech Software, also from 1987. They're known for their Wizardry series of games, if you've seen those. And trust me, I have not included this game for its playability. Check out this weird landing sequence here. But the game, as you can see, is beautifully illustrated, and of course the 3D component performs really well even on an original IBM PC. The problem is controllability. It took me many attempts to get this landing and takeoff here, for example, correct on video. And even in the main part of the game, in space, where you're flying around protecting the planets in the system that you're caretaker of from these invading spacecraft, is really hard to control. This sort of thing where you're destroying an enemy spacecraft is really pretty rare. And on a 286 it's not much better. Performance was never an issue in the first place. In fact, this is just running at 6 megahertz. I found it really difficult to figure out how to land on the planets, and most of the time you just spend spinning out of control. There is a game speed option, but it really doesn't help here. The issue, once again, is trying to line things up so you can actually play the game. Check out, for example, this landing sequence here and the subsequent takeoff, where I just end up spinning around. I gave up trying to get this right on video and just decided to leave it in to show you how difficult it is. This was my best attempt after really quite a number of tries. This is F19 Stealth Fighter from 1988, and I've lowered the volume here because it really is ear-piercing when this thing takes off. Now, this is based on a fictional US aircraft. People had speculated that there was no F-19 in the US catalogue, and so maybe the aircraft was just classified. In fact, this game was released on the day that the US admitted the existence of the F-117A Nighthawk, and of course later on they made a game based on that aircraft, where you could still play this original fictional one as well. People like Sid Meier and Andy Hollis were involved in this. This is the EGA version, and unfortunately the sound is no better. The game itself was produced first on DOS and then later ported to the Atari, which is usually the opposite of what normally happens. But it was actually based on an earlier game, Project Stealth Fighter, for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. Now, there's a little bit of corruption, unfortunately, in the EGA version that I had here. This may have been because it doesn't like various EGA chipsets. It's very possible that this would actually run on some EGA cards, but not on others. And I did encounter a few things like this as I went through the games. And I've left that in here just to illustrate that once again, what can go wrong on original hardware. A second jet fighter simulator that I want to look at is F16 Combat Pilot by Digital Integration from 1989. And as you'll see, this is beautifully illustrated and it runs quite well even on an IBM PC at 4.77 MHz, which you can see here. Now obviously this is an EGA game, not CGA, and yet it runs smoothly nonetheless. Now, unfortunately, the game was really overshadowed by Spectrum Holobyte's Falcon, which was reportedly better with the graphics and with the sound for the era. Here it is running on a 286, and as you see, it's dead smooth. But the amazing thing about this game is that at its heart, it's really simulating an actual F-16C fighting Falcon, at least as well as technology would allow back in the day. And the gameplay itself is really a lot of fun. There are lots of campaigns and they actually evolve in real time dynamically, which is pretty unusual for games of the era. The aircraft is really quite manoeuvrable. You can fly it upside down, and it's a little bit hard to control, pretty easy to crash into the ground, but again that's because of realism. I think it's really a shame that this game was overlooked by so many. Well, it's time to get back to just ordinary 4-colour CGA just for the moment. This is Interphase by the assembly line, and it's running here on an IBM PC at 4.77 MHz, and I think acceptably well for 1989. This tunnel scene, which is reminiscent of Descent, runs quite well. The game itself is a little slow to be playing on this machine, but on a 286 the performance is nothing short of astonishing. So the introductory scene here runs very smoothly, and it takes up almost all the graphical area, but the thing that really surprised me about this game is the sheer number of 3D objects that are rendered without any perceptible drop in frame rate, and not just simple geometric shapes but complex 3D objects. There's also this really neat smooth scrolling in this 2D section of map here which recurs throughout the game. This is essentially a first-person shooter game, but also a puzzle game, a really interesting combination. They borrowed concepts for this game from another video game called Neuromancer, which they actually licensed for specifically this purpose. You might know the assembly line from another one of their games called Stunt Island. Now, there is a little bit of corruption, as you can see, in the status bar at the bottom, and I had this with a number of EGA cards, and I think what happens is games are preserved and they're tested on one particular kind of graphics card, but they unfortunately have corruption in others. And now we come to Silpheed from 1988 running on the IBM PC. Now this introduction, which is almost 10 minutes long, runs really slowly, so I've just cut out a few sections of it here because it's really interesting. Now the game itself was originally on the PC 8801 in 1986, and it was released for DOS in 1989 by Sierra. But take a look at this introductory sequence. It's all pre-rendered of course, but it's still 3D and really quite interesting. It's wireframe, and once you get to the end of this very long tunnel here, which really just takes forever on the PC, you finally encounter the namesake of the game, the Silpheed aircraft, and it for all the world just looks like an AutoCAD drawing or something that you might see an architect working with, which I think makes this game really something quite special. But wait until you see the 286 version with EGA graphics. It also has an amazing soundtrack, which I'll let you listen to right now. Well, unfortunately you can see that the game itself is a little bit of a letdown. It's really just 2D. Those are just animated sprites. They are changing size and rotating, but there's no 3D real-time graphics going on here at all. The next game is Star Wars by Vector Graphics from 1987, again running on the IBM PC, and I found it quite difficult to play on this platform. The issue is that you need 2 keys on one side of the keyboard to move left and right, and 2 on the other side of the keyboard to move up and down, and then the space bar to fire, and it just always seemed to be overshooting where I wanted to fire, and also just firing at the wrong time, not when I was pressing the key. Now on the 286, at even just 6 megahertz here, it actually worked much better, and after a while I started to get the hang of it, although I do admit that I had to play this game really a lot in order to get onto the second level so that I could show that to you. But the idea is you shoot these stars that are fired at you from the TIE fighters and other enemy craft, and then if you're lucky enough to get through this level, then the big Death Star appears, and then it moves on to the second level of the game. And in this one you have to fire at towers. Now I found this impossible to do on the IBM PC. Even after getting to this level multiple times, which was already hard enough, I wasn't able to dislodge any of the tops of these towers. But as you can see on the 286, for some reason, even though it was still overshooting a lot, I was able to manage this. And as far as graphics are concerned, well, it's wireframe, as you can see. Certainly a very interesting example from the era. The next game is Stellar 7 from 1990, and I've included this one because, once again, it's really well illustrated. It's perhaps not so clear in the CGI version here. There's too many speckles in the image for my liking, but when you get to the EGA version, you'll see what I'm talking about, I think. Now, the gameplay itself is quite difficult to get used to. You have to go about and fire at these sled-mounted cannons, and I managed to do that a few times on film without trouble. But these metallic birds, whatever they are much more difficult to hit. You spend a lot of time chasing them, and then the missiles, after you fire them, just seem to miss. The bird just flies on ahead of them. So it's really quite an art to hit those, and I did eventually manage to get it on film. But I want to show you the 286 version of this game with EGA graphics and ad-lib sound. The game does support the Sound Blaster in theory, but unfortunately I had some problems with the game locking up in the opening sequence whenever I selected that option. So there's just ad-lib sound here. For example, on the Sound Blaster there is spoken samples here instead of just some background sounds. And from the rest of it onwards, it's basically just ad-lib music, which doesn't really change between the Sound Blaster and an ad-lib. So that's what you've got here. As for the EGA graphics, well, as you can see, it looks way better than the CGA. They've made great use of colour here. And as I said, I had a lot of trouble shooting these birds that are flying around, and I was very pleased when I finally managed to do it on video. If you fire the missile just enough ahead, you'll eventually get one of these things. The final game I want to look at is Mech Warrior, and it is one of the most colourful and beautifully illustrated games of the lot, and the performance here is astounding. This is 1989. It's only EGA, it doesn't have a CGA version that I'm aware of, but on the 286 here it's incredible. It in theory runs on an 8088, but I don't think it's really playable there. It's a very complex game. At first I wasn't exactly sure what to do in this game. There are a bunch of different missions, and there's also a great variety in the arenas where you actually play the game. There's some of them at night time, the colours are different between them and so on. So it's a game with a lot of variety. But as far as gameplay is concerned, I was a bit confused at various times whether I was doing the right thing. For example, in this arena here, I wasn't really sure whether I was supposed to be shooting this mech or not, and I fired and fired and fired, and nothing seemed to be happening. And eventually the thing finally succumbed, so I figured out that must be the right thing to do. And finally, at last, it told me that this had been a most excellent victory, so I guess I got it right in the end. So definitely one of my favourite games of the lot. Anyway, that'll be it for this week, but thanks very much to everybody who liked and commented on the video last week. Go back and look at the number of views that video got compared to other ones we've had on the channel, and you'll see that we're really onto a winning formula here. So let me know in the comments below, what 3D games did you play back in the day, and what was your favourite one? And don't forget to give the video a like. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you in a later video, and bye bye.